Hello and welcome to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Williams, and today we're going to be talking about functional behavioral assessment. This is the second in a series of lectures on FBAs. An FBA, or a functional behavioral assessment, is part of what you'll be using in your behavior modification project. Today I want to talk a little bit about some of the methods, in particular the indirect methods that occur before or as part of the early part of functional behavioral assessment. Functional behavioral assessment usually involves several methods. It can include 2 or as many as 3, and today, so it can include indirect methods. It usually includes direct methods, and it may include an experimental functional behavioral analysis that we'll talk about a little bit later. So today we're going to focus on indirect methods. And so indirect methods are the beginning of the functional behavioral assessment program, is to collect data that is either based on self-report or exists in other kinds of records. So it will include things like behavioral interviews and questionnaires, check sheets. You may go in and look at school records or medical records or records of previous treatment. And it is also known as informant assessment. The important point to make here is that the data are derived from non-direct methods. It's provided by other people or other sources rather than directly observing the behavior. So let's begin with a behavioral interview. A functional assessment begins with an interview of, with interviews, plural, of the client, parents, teachers, caregivers, siblings, spouses, any of the people who have contact with or experience with the problem behavior that you are intervening on. Interviews are based on self-report, so their value is limited. But they can provide a little bit of information or a little bit of guidance for your later direct assessment. So as a result, interview-based information is considered indirect evidence. Why? Because it could be potentially biased or misinformed. When you start using self-report from a variety of people, you'll find that it goes through their individual filter. It's hard to not include perspective. And so the interview has to be very highly structured and very detailed to help individuals, help your interviewee focus on the aspects of behavior rather than providing broad, less useful sorts of information. It's also the case that having multiple interviews, so interviewing the teacher, the parent, the sibling, and the child, for example, in a classroom, a problem behavior situation in a classroom, can provide, those multiple interviews can help to triangulate on what's common, what's similar in their perspectives, where is the overlap. That will help you to narrow in on what aspects of the behavior you might want to look for when you go in to do your direct interventions. Functional assessments always move on to more direct assessments using direct observation. But the functional assessment piece is, the indirect portion of this is important to help guide the direct assessment later. So let's talk a little bit about the structured FBA interview. I will mention that in Canvas, along with the PowerPoints, there is a copy of a PDF of a structured interview that I pulled off of the web. It's a school-based FBA, but it's very detailed and provides lots of examples, and I'm going to steal a few screenshots from that piece here to give you examples, but you can go back and look at it. You can also Google functional behavioral assessment and go in and try to find more examples if you want to. But this will be a good basic beginning, and then I'll be providing you with the functional behavioral assessment for your project, the forms for your project. So a structured FBA interview, the first thing you want to make sure that it includes is a complete demographic summary of your client. So we would like a complete idea of who the person is and what the problem behavior is. A client records profile that includes previous interventions that have been attempted that have either succeeded in the short term or failed altogether. We use these interviews to help pull out and identify what the problem behavior is, what's included, what's excluded. You've done a little bit of that in terms of operational definitions. That's good. Identifying the context of the problem behavior. Usually problem behaviors happen in certain environments, around certain people, or under certain circumstances. So identifying what those circumstances are, identifying those specific high-risk conditions or those prompts and cues and antecedents in the environment that kind of get the behavior going. It allows you also to identify possible consequences that are maintaining the target behavior. In addition, the use of the FBA can also be used to identify possible reinforcers for the individual by identifying preferred activities, preferred foods, preferred games, and so it can help you identify reinforcers that you can use later when you go in to do your intervention. And then ultimately, after you've done your entire FBA assessment, you'll build a summary statement where you draw conclusions from all of the sources of information and put together what looks like your idea of what might be operating. So that when you go in to do your direct assessment, you'll be guided by this information. So let me give you an example of the sample structured FBA interview form. I was going to try to scroll through the PDF, but I actually took screenshots. So here we go. So this is from a school-based intervention. And so here's a functional behavioral assessment teacher interview form. And you'll notice at the top that you want to identify who the interviewer is, the date of the interview, who the student is, and who the respondent, who the person you're interviewing is. Is this the vice principal? Is it the counselor? Is it the teacher? Who are you talking to? And often, the way these are conducted is that this is done in an interview format, so you don't just hand this sheet to someone and tell them to fill it out. Instead, you use this as a prompt to have a conversation about these issues, and you take notes on the form. So you say, please, can you describe the behavior of concern? And let them talk and give you information, and then you can take notes as to what they say. How often does a behavior occur? How long does it last? How intense is the behavior? You also ask them about precipitating or events or antecedent events. So what's happening when the behavior occurs? What's going on? Where and when is the behavior most likely to occur? With whom is it most likely to occur? What kinds of conditions are most likely to precipitate or set off the behavior? Now, this interview goes on for several pages, but I just want to give you an idea that this is fairly structured, and you'll ask them to go through and answer these questions, and then you'll take notes. You can also include a problem behavior questionnaire where this you can have them fill out, and you would allow them to read this is part of the teacher interview, and they are to circle the frequency at which each of the following statements is true. And their choices here, I'm going to use my cursor. The choices here are never, 10% of the time, 25, 50, 75% of the time, 90% of the time, and always. So they're going to be circling one of these 7 possibilities for each of these questions. And this one goes on for a long period of time, but I'll just read you a couple of them. So number 1, does the problem behavior occur and persist when you make a request to perform a task? So if you ask them to do something, how do they respond with this problem behavior? When the problem behavior occurs, do you redirect the student back to the task or to follow the rules? During a conflict with peers, if the student engages in a problem behavior, do peers leave the student alone? When the problem occurs, do peers verbally respond or laugh at the student? And so you've got a whole series of questions that help you identify all of the things that are going on with respect to this behavior. If we jump down here near the bottom, number 10, does the problem behavior stop when peers stop interacting with the student? Does the behavior occur when peers are attending to other students? If the student engages in the problem behavior, do you provide one-to-one instruction to get the student back on task? So what we're really doing is trying to find out what's been done, and what works and what doesn't work, and what happens before the behavior starts and what happens when the behavior is occurring and after the behavior occurs. So you have a whole checklist that the person can go in and fill out. Also at least a page or more long. Here is the student assisted interview form. So this is where you would identify who your interviewer and who your respondent is, the date of the interview, and the respondent here would be the student. So these are questions that you would actually ask the client. You can actually interview the client. It depends on who your client is. If they're typically developing children or adults, you can probably do this. When you start moving into populations with people who have disabilities, how verbal they are may determine whether or not you can do a client-assisted interview form or not, and you may and how well they communicate verbally may also determine whether you can use this form. Here is another checklist. This is a functional assessment checklist for teachers or staff, caregivers, parents, people who are watching the behavior. And here, this is one that's based on problem behaviors at school. So they check off what the behavior is, and then they're asked to watch. And at certain times, they're supposed to write down what the activity is, the time of the day, what the activity is, and the likelihood of that problem behavior, and what the problem behavior actually is. So they go through and they select, you then go through and select several of these for further assessment and select those based on similarity of activities or conditions with ratings of 4, 5, and 6. And similarity of behaviors. So it helps you identify which ones are not really a behavior and which ones are bigger problem, which ones are not problem behaviors and which ones are higher problem behaviors. So this can be very helpful. Here is another form. This is all from the same assessment. This is something they do all of these when at the school that this is used at, they use all of these. Here they ask the teacher, here again they're talking to the teacher or a staff member to talk about what the problem behavior looks like, to identify the specific situation, those high-risk behaviors from the previous section where they're rating the behaviors, let's see here, where they're rating the behaviors in the high 4, 5, or 6. Those are the specific behavior problems that you then transfer to the next one, and you say, okay, so let's talk about when this particular situation happens. What does the behavior look like? How often does it occur? How long does it last? What's the intensity of that behavior? So now you have more of an interview-like form, and you have them talk about it. And then what are the events that predict the behaviors? So these are the antecedents or predictors. And what are the consequences, so that you get a better feel for what the ABCs of behavior really look like. So indirect behaviors help to define the behavior in detail as they're viewed by other people. They identify contributing factors like medications or who's present or staffing patterns that always occurs when Mrs. Jones is on the playground. It identifies antecedents, the who, what, where, when of what comes before, and it can help identify consequences. So and that's really tells you about the function of the behavior. What's its purpose? Is the individual getting attention? Is the individual actually able to escape the task? Are they able to, do they hate the playground so they misbehave so that they get sent to the office? And if that happens reliably, then maybe the problem is the child is not fitting in well on the playground, right? So determining if there are any alternative behaviors that are already in place. Are there other behaviors that you can get them to do? Can you redirect their behavior and find out, when people redirect their behavior, what behaviors do they prefer to do, and will they engage in without the problem behavior? So identifying what those alternative behaviors are. And you can also get a history of previous treatments. You can create a form that says, what have they done in the past, and how effective was it, and how long did the intervention seem to last? How easy was it to implement? Things like that. Now, as part of your indirect assessment, you want to make sure that you're asking questions about those antecedents that set things off. And so I created this little form. You want to know if there are any medical or emotional antecedents. You want to know if there are any environmental or social or interactional antecedents, curricular or instructional prompts and cues and things that precipitate the behavior, and any personal issues. So under each of these, you may want to ask questions about these particular topics. So for example, under medical emotional, you can get information about what kind of medications are they on, when were they most recently changed, and whether or not the problem behaviors seem to peak around medication adjustments or diet adjustments. Are they getting enough sleep? Are they wearing clothing that makes them uncomfortable? When they're wearing when they're too hot, does that tend to predict what's happening? In terms of environmental things, you want to know whether you want to ask about auditory stimuli or visual stimuli. Some people, for example, with autism are sensitive to sound, and that can set them off. Do they seem to do well in a small one-on-one or small group, or does it happen more when they're in a great big class where they're not getting enough attention? Does it happen during transitions? Social, are peers involved? Are staff involved? Is it a particular peer? Is it a particular staff member that seems to be around the individual when the behavior sets off? Is it when they work close together with other individuals? Is it a social skills issue? Is it when they are required to have social skills and they don't have them? So you want to know about social and interactional issues. Curriculum is important because you want to know about, if this happens when they're asked to do tasks, what is it about the task? Is it the difficulty, the duration, the level of insistence or instruction that they're receiving, how meaningful the task is to them, or whether it's a preferred or a non-preferred task? And then finally, personal issues. Are they being asked to make choices? Are they very routine dependent? And when you alter their routine, is there a problem? Do they have particular likes and dislikes? Do they have emotional issues or coping skills? Is there a distraction or perseveration going on? And so you can add these, you want to review these possible antecedents and put them into your interview so that you can ask questions that are very specific to the possible cues in the environment that set the behavior off. Now, this is my last slide. Indirect methods, advantages and disadvantages. Indirect methods are very convenient. It's easy to sit down and interview someone and get a lot of information. It's highly structured, so it's not like you just ask them one question and they say, oh, he just wants attention. They're very structured, and so it really can help target and narrow aspects of the problem behavior. It's reasonably objective, so that when you ask people to be this specific, they tend to try to be more objective than when you just let them say a few words about the behavior. Then it tends to be a big summary and not very useful. They can help you develop a hypothesis about what the actual nature and function of the behavior is and what's going on. And it also, although this may not sound important, it creates buy-in from important other people. So when you ask the counselor and you ask the teacher and the playground supervisor and the parent, and you spend time to do one of these structured interviews, they feel like you are paying attention to what they're saying. You're taking their information as a meaningful and important part of your intervention. And it helps them buy in to the therapy, the intervention that you develop once you've done your direct assessment. So that's an important piece. If the people involved aren't going to cooperate with your treatment, it's not going to succeed. So these structured interviews can be very useful. The disadvantages, there's a lot of work. You have to construct these interviews for the specific situation, child, and setting. And so you can't just pull one off the web and ask questions because the questions may not be relevant. You actually have to construct it. There is always room for potential bias. And it can be based on the interviewee's interpretation of what's going on. And it only provides information to the questions that you ask. If there are things that you don't ask about, you're not going to find out that information. So you can miss important data. So that's all I'm going to say about the indirect methods for functional behavioral assessment. In the next lecture, I'll talk about direct methods. Have a great day.